Welcome to the Living Well podcast. I'm Mark Hennick. This is a show about change. A lot has changed recently, or is changing, or has become desperately obvious that it needs to change. For many of us, the COVID-19 pandemic pulled the rug out from under our normal life. Nothing is normal anymore. Whether we'll go back to the way things were or find some new normal remains to be seen. But whatever happens next, we're faced with the prospect of figuring it out as we go. And that's why this is also a show about resilience. It's about how we're adapting to the massive changes we've faced across virtually every aspect of our lives, and how we can hopefully use this opportunity for good. The Pride movement is probably most recognizable for its worldwide celebrations, the parties and the parades, filled with joyful expressions of freedom and of acceptance. It has helped generations of LGBTQ people find their truest self at any age or stage of their life. But Pride is also rooted in protest. It's a call, a fight for equality that, even 50 years since the Stonewall riots, is vitally necessary in a world that's still far from equal. This is especially true for trans, BIPOC, and other marginalized populations within the LGBTQ community itself. This year, however, the party and the protest of Pride Month this past June look very different. Public expressions were largely hampered, replaced in stark contrast with the isolation, frustration, and distance that we've been facing through these long months of the pandemic lockdown. On this episode of Living Well, we explore the impact of the pandemic on Pride, but we also consider the broader historical evolution of the movement through the experience of two people who together have been part of a good chunk of it. My guests on the show today are Peter Coleridge, the former president and CEO of Prostate Cancer Canada, former president of Big Brothers Big Sisters Canada, and Patrick Smith, the current president and CEO of the Centre of Excellence on Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Both are former national president and CEOs of the Canadian Mental Health Association, and they're also a power couple of sorts in the Canadian health and well-being space. Peter and Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So the whole reason I wanted to have you on the show was because I wanted to do something for Morneau Chappelle, since we're focusing on the many ways in which our lives have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted to do an episode specifically focused on the LGBTQ community and how things look different this year with Pride Month having just passed in a very different way. And I wanted to bring you guys in to have a bit of a conversation about the historical perspective of the Pride movement, a bit of your own personal story, and how things are, how you expect things are to be moving forward. So Patrick, you're not hard to get to start talking. You're already trying to jump in. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Mark. No, I think it's actually interesting because we do have a fairly unique story to tell about that journey. So Peter and I were both inaugural vice presidents at KMH. Both of us came from the Addiction Research Foundation, one of the four founding partners of KMH. And in the early days, it was the Addiction Research Foundation, the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, Queen Street Mental Health Center, and the Don Wood Institute. Now, those were four very different healthcare cultures, and we're talking 1998. So the Don Wood Institute, which had a rainbow services program for LGBTQ clients with substance use issues, they had a tradition of having a flag raising at their organization. And so as a newly formed KMH, embracing diversity in the workplace, they asked me to, as a senior vice president of clinical programs, to speak at the flag raising. And when I look back at that, what I also think was unique is the president and CEO, Paul Garfinkel, and the COO, Gene Simpson, they bookended my presentation. So they were allies. They weren't in the LGBTQ community, but I did make mention during that time what it was like for me. This is the first time in a position that I had authentically integrated my sexuality into my workplace. And to be honest, I used to think, who I sleep with and who I love shouldn't have that much of an impact in my day-to-day work as a vice president in a mental health and addictions organization.
And you would think that by the 90s in particular, it wouldn't be that big of a deal.
Well, and in fact, I was feeling I don't need to wave a flag. And in my experience, and I had a great time. I did the flag raising kind of opening, and it was to the converted. It was all the people that wanted to come to celebrate were there. So it was really kind of a very comfortable audience. What I noticed is this one guy that I used to see on the elevator. He worked in the mail room at the Clark, and he was kind of, slinking in the shadows. And he wasn't comfortable being there, it didn't seem. And a few days later, I saw him in the elevator with freedom rings, which is rainbow-colored rings, usually worn by someone celebrating Pride. And that changed my perspective because I realized that for the first time, it did matter whether I lived authentically and shared that part of myself at work. It didn't matter as much for me because I was comfortable as a vice president, but it mattered for the people who maybe worked in the mailroom and worked on nursing units. Lots more to talk about, but the journey from 1998 to now has been incredible.
I want to bring Peter in for a second here, too, to hear your perspective. I mean, you were working in the same place at the same time, Peter. Did you have the same or similar experience or perspective on the acceptance of the place?
Yeah, absolutely. Patrick and I were partners at that time. It was a time before we could legally be married. I wasn't really out. I mean, I didn't hide my sexuality, but I certainly wasn't out there telling people about, my male partner, et cetera, et cetera. So, part of it is getting comfortable in your own skin and then being in an environment that helps you be comfortable in your own skin. And certainly, that was starting to unfold at CAMH and things, improved not only there, but in many workplaces over time.
An interesting twist on the Pride flag raising is that the next year it was at the Clark site. And again, everyone came who was supportive, and I spoke again. And the third year, they gave me the date, and I said, "Oh, that's not going to work. That's going to coincide and conflict with our annual general meeting as an organization." And it was to be held at the Queen Street site. And then I thought, no, why do we have to do it off in the shadows for only those who want to come? Why don't we do it at the AGM? And then they also politely told me, Patrick, we need some fresh meat. So you've done it 2 years in a row. And we really like someone else. And I said, I have just the person for you.
Yeah. And that was quite an experience.
That was you, Peter. Yeah, so we're on a podcast. They can't see that Patrick just gestured to Peter.
Yeah, so that was me. You're right. That was me. And I when Patrick mentioned it to me, I really had to think about, do I want to be that out there? As I said, I was not hiding anything, but I wasn't necessarily really being public about things, and certainly not in the workplace. So I had to give it some thought, quite frankly, but it was probably one of the most empowering things that I've done. It was a turning point for me in my sexuality, in my own skin. And since that time, as Patrick mentioned earlier, I too, in leadership roles, realized how important it was to be more out in the workplace and to really bring this out in the open, to empower others in workplaces who are part of the community to feel like they can be out at work as well. And so from a leadership perspective, it's an important thing I think we have to do as leaders is to create that environment, because even with the progress, it's still very difficult for many people to come out, and you need environments that reinforce that it's okay.
Is it your view that Pride is primarily a protest of sorts, that it's creating space, demanding space within society, or is it more of a celebration of the space that you already have?
I think that one of the things that it has done is it honors the people who've gone before us. It's a celebration of all of the pioneers that did this work when they didn't have the CEO and the COO bookending you and your support. We're celebrating the developments we've made as a civil rights movement, if you will. But it's also a statement that we are not there yet. And so every year, as we have more rights, it also shines a brighter light on those rights that are still not there, and looking at things like protection in healthcare, trans rights. It's become something that's actually more focused on continuing the momentum, celebrating the milestones, but not getting complacent.
Is that how you feel as well, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it really has evolved, and many, many years ago, decades ago, it was probably more of an advocacy, putting the spotlight on the need for change. But now clearly it's both. And as Patrick said, have to continue to keep up the volume, because complacency will start to retract, and certainly. In other countries, you see that when there is that complacency, and political leadership has such a big impact on that. And so important to continue to keep the spotlight and push forward on normalizing and creating that environment, which I keep coming back to, which I feel is so important.
Something that you're saying here, and Peter, have you brought this kind of lens with you into these leadership roles in these different audiences?
Absolutely. In the various organizations, I made sure I brought this lens. New programs were put in place with an LGBTQ lens, and providing access and so on, and certainly within the workplace in terms of staff and employees. Something that I've carried forward in all those organizations. And it's interesting, in my entire career, once you start to integrate corporate world, the for-profit world, and the not-for-profit charity world, or causes, whether it's mental health or LGBT rights, you get a lot of people that see it in a very negative light, because these corporations are involved because of flavor of the day, and it's going to help get exposure and profile, and that's all about increasing profits. But there's so many other benefits as well. So there are pluses and minuses, but I think that intersection is so important around all of these different causes and the support for all kinds of not-for-profit work across the country. And so it's been an interesting debate.
I think also one great example is Curacao, as the island used to get a lot of flack because it chased the pink dollar, is what people said. It really tried to very proactively promote its tourism and LGBTQ kind of positivity to the gay community. And guess what? That's probably true. But then when we went there, you felt it. So it actually probably had a huge role in changing how it felt to be in a Caribbean island as a gay man.
And that sense of overt acceptance, I imagine that must have been impacted this year in particular, where, this past June, we couldn't have the parades or a lot of the corporate type events, the sponsorships, good or bad. How do you think that impacted the Pride movement, not being able to be so overt in the celebration or the protest, whichever it is?
I think it probably had impact for different people at different stages in their journey. And I remember going to one in Toronto, early days, and so I remember what that felt like as this uber acceptance, as you say, very overt acceptance. But I also remember standing with a friend of mine from Mexico, and when media came by, he ran behind and said, no cameras, no cameras, no cameras, because he was so uncomfortable that maybe there would be that captured and aired in his hometown. I just remember how powerful that is. Now, if it's your first few times, and it's all virtual, it doesn't have the same impact.
So, Peter, then how do you think that, because we don't know when this is going to end, right? We don't know when the world is going to go either back to normal or into the new normal, whatever it is. So how does the Pride movement, the LGBT community, continue to advocate, continue to connect with one another without the ability to do so physically, at least not so robustly?
Well, I think we're moving into a new world, a new normal as a result of the pandemic. And it's amazing that the type of technology that we're using today has existed for quite some time in many other formats as well. And we've all kind of dipped our toe in it, but yet, we'd fly to meetings, or there'd be big pride parades or meetings of organizations looking from a policy perspective how to exert pressure on governments around LGBT policies and rights and so on. All of that work, I think, is just going to continue in a different way, and everyone is going to be adjusting to looking at ways to doing that. And I think technology is going to be, the way forward, and there will be less of the big sort of mass coming together of people. And so, I think the work will continue. I think it'll continue at the same levels. It's just people adjusting to doing it differently, and that'll take some time. But I think it is definitely a new normal as we move forward. And I don't think this community will let the fact that maybe gatherings can't happen get in the way of continuing to keep the volume up and the spotlight, so that the complacency doesn't allow us to slip back on the progress we've made.
Patrick, I was going to ask Patrick, do you think that there's a risk of that backslide?
Yeah, yes and no. I think in some ways the context is so different. When I remember when I first, moved to Toronto and first integrated, and I actually flew my mom up here, and I came out to my mom here in Toronto and took her to Woody's, the gay bar, with a lot of my friends, and so that she could see what gay meant, because back in Southern Indiana, maybe you didn't have that picture. And think about that.
Sorry, Peter's laughing, but we'll get to that in a second.
And the reality is, gay, what it means to be gay has really changed for the average person in Southern Indiana, because back then, there was no will and grace. There were just filming Queer as Folk on the streets of Toronto and making it look like Pittsburgh or Baltimore. I can't remember where it was supposed to be. So that was all happening. And now, and so the Pride parades, and even having a section where all the gay bars are in one area of town, even that is changing. While that's still the case, integration of having LGBTQ nights in mainstream bars and gay-friendly spaces, it's less ghettoized, if you will. And so we used to always call it the gay ghetto, and using that in a very positive term. But the role of the gay ghetto has changed as well. And so in some ways, so has the role of the Pride Parade, because it's less separated and segmented from the group. It's kind of like maybe the metaphor of the image flag raising, off on the side for people who support it, versus at the AGM. And the first time Peter Zuna is coming out, Michael Wilson's there, like everyone on the board is there. It's not just people who support you. And I think that is the change that's happened. And now, even when we can't gather, if you're binge watching Netflix, you have a lot of representation of the very different things that it can mean to be in the queer community. And that just didn't happen when I first came out.
Now, you guys have been, another reason that I wanted to have you on, you've been together for quite a while, haven't you? An anniversary just passed or is coming up?
Just celebrated 20 years in June.
20 years. Wow. Yeah. And now one of you is retired. Peter, you're finally retired.
Yeah.
Patrick
But that's an early retirement. I don't want your listeners to think that I'm not.
The listeners to think
that I'm really old.
and Patrick will eventually retire someday, maybe, who knows, it seems. Right. But I think even that is still surprisingly mold breaking in a way. That, a long-term gay couple who are now a long-term, almost fully retired gay couple, living their best lives, who have done, it sounds like, a lot of what you really wanted to do with your lives.
Well, for me, as you know, screenwriting is my kind of side passion. So I always think, okay, what am I going to do? I am extremely impassioned with my new work. I've only been there a year. And so making sure that veterans and their families across Canada have access to the best, best practice PTSD, services and supports, that's a passion. And when we've set this organization up and it's off and running and doing its great work and I retire, I've often thought about that, and I always go back to one of the first things that happened to me when I had that experience of seeing what my impact of just doing a talk and being open about my experience, what it did to that young man in the mailroom. I started to go on the circuit doing leaders out at work, and so really focusing on the obligation that you have as leaders. And I know Peter and I have talked about this, but one of the things I'd love to do is to provide, my volunteer services to youth peer organizations, queer youth organizations, because we still hear every day, like I think about growing up when I did in Southern Indiana, and I can tell you that growing up in my same small town, it hasn't changed as much as we'd like it to. So that's kind of where my passion would go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, Mark, when I think about, I guess, the second half, for me, it's still early days, but, my career has been a gift. I worked hard at it, but I have a lot of experience and insights, and so it's nice to now have the time to spend, as Patrick said, volunteering with youth organizations or just even individual youth who, we have lots of friends who have children who are now, in their teens and 20s, and being able to have the time to be a mentor. I spent some time leading a national mentoring organization, and, it was amazing to see the impact of mentorship on people. And I started to reflect on my own life and my early days as a teenager, struggling with whether I was gay and having mentors. And then, throughout my journey up until that time when I was able to really come out at the AGM, as Patrick talked about earlier and we spoke about earlier. And so I'm really excited about being able to be a mentor in very informal ways and maybe more formal ways moving forward with young people, because I just think it's so important, and that level of support is so key for so many people, and has a big impact on lives. And I just think that's what it's all about.
So if any of those either young people that you're talking about are listening now, or people who might be a little bit later into their journey, because you both came out publicly a little bit later, what would you want them to know?
I think the thing I would want to say is what I feared most about myself is this: what if this little dark secret would be the thing that came out? Every single person who comes out, whether they come out at age 15 or 30 or 60, and that's still happening today, when they finally realize, it's like pay no attention to the man behind the black curtain in The Wizard of Oz. When you pull that curtain, what you fear most is it's actually your source of power. And so for no matter what part of the journey you're on for life, living an authentic self and authentically being who you are, for me, was a source of so much personal power. Not to say it won't be tested from time to time, but there is just something about being so completely comfortable in your own skin. And I can tell you, if you would have told me earlier that that's what was going to happen, I would have said, no, you don't understand my circumstances, my family, my friends. There's always the sense that it's going to be the thing that is unravels you. And it's quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Patrick has said it, very well. It's not as bad on the other side as you may, in your mind, think it's going to be. And if you can reach out and get support and talk to some people about it, and maybe even link up with a mentor from the gay community. That's going to allow you to take that step, and it is very empowering. It's a turning point, that authentic self. And at the end of the day, we all only have one life, and so why live it in the shadows? Be your authentic self. And I love Shrek the musical, and let your freak flag fly. I mean, it's a way to go, and you feel really good about it.
Yeah. So then it sounds like Pride is, while maybe both protest and party, and certainly about equality, Pride is really about freedom, it seems.
Yeah.
Pride in your personal journey and freedom. That's a very good way to, I like that.
Well, Peter Coleridge, former president and CEO of Prostate Cancer Canada, Patrick Smith, current president and CEO of the Centre of Excellence on Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Peter and Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Living Well podcast. Mark Hennick is our host and executive producer. If you like what you heard, subscribe to the show. There's no cost involved. You just hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a comment and a rating to let us know how we're doing. For more information about the show and the WellCan project, visit wellcan.ca. The Living Well podcast is produced for Morneau Chappelle by Mark Hennick and Eye Contact Productions. I'm Dave Trafford.